p.m. Uh, this is a, wait a minute, it's the wrong one. This is a WebEx meeting regarding the May 21, strike that, May 19, 2020 regular session of the Woodland City Council. And I would like to make clear for the record of this meeting, and it should be reflected in the minutes, that this meeting will be conducted pursuant to Governor Newsom's executive order N29-20. This meeting will be held via teleconference, and council members will participate via teleconference. Their locations are not listed on the agenda and are not accessible to the public. The public is encouraged to listen to the City Council meeting live on Woodland TV Channel 20, and also by going to the City of Woodland website at www.cityofwoodland.org/meetings. A member of the public wishes to make a comment during the general public comment period or on a specific agenda item, there are two ways to do that. First, members of the public were invited to leave a voicemail message at 530-661-5900. All voicemail messages received by 6 p.m. tonight will be played during the City Council meeting and read into the record at the appropriate time. Any member of the public who wishes to make a comment on an item and is watching on the live stream may submit an email to the city clerk at councilmeetings@cityofwoodland.org prior to the public comment on that item. Email comments submitted to be read into the record shall be no more than 3 minutes when read aloud. Please include the agenda item on your subject line. At this time, Madam Clerk, item D, roll call, please.
Thank you. Councilmember Barajas?
Here.
Councilmember Fernandez?
Present.
Mayor Landsberg?
Present.
Councilmember Rodriguez? Mayor Pro Tem Stallard?
Present.
Thank you. So we have 4 council members present at this time.
Thank you, Madam Clerk. Continue, please.
I would like to request that each member of the council respond to these questions. Mayor Pro Tem Stallard, can you hear me well?
Yes, Madam Clerk.
Councilmember Barajas, can you hear me well?
Yes, I can.
Councilmember Fernandez, can you hear me well?
Yes, ma'am.
Councilmember Rodriguez, have you arrived yet? No. Okay, does each member of the council have a copy of the agenda for this meeting?
Yes.
Excuse me, Mayor Pro Tem Stallard.
Yes.
Thank you. Mayor Landsberg.
Yes.
Councilmember Barajas.
Yes.
Councilmember Fernandez.
Yes.
Thank you.
Now, Madam Clerk, have you posted tonight's agenda at a location which is reasonably accessible to the members of the public?
Yes, I have.
Let the record reflect that all 4 of the 5 council members are present. We expect the 5th member to arrive soon and have indicated that they were able to hear the proceedings. At this time, I'm requesting that other city officials introduce themselves and their positions so that the record can reflect their attendance, starting with our city manager, Ken Hyatt.
Yes, good evening, Mr. Mayor, members of the council. Ken Hyatt, interim city manager here.
Good evening, Mayor and City Council. This is Kara Uweta, City Attorney.
Good evening, Mayor and council members. This is Ana Gonzalez, City Clerk.
And Mayor, I'd like to acknowledge that there are other staff members on the call as well, specifically Police Chief Derek Caff, Acting Fire Chief Eric Zane, Community Services Director Christine Engel, Public Works Director Craig Locke, Acting Community Development Director Brent Meyer, Finance Officer Kim McKinney, IT Manager Scott Sallin, and also want to acknowledge there are several other staff members on the call as well, as they have consent items should the council choose to pull those and like to discuss them.
Thank you, Mr. Hyatt. Now, as we go through tonight's agenda, I would request that before speaking, please identify yourself each time before you speak. For example, this is Councilmember Barajas, etc. Let the individual speak and please do not interrupt the individual. I would also ask that to the greatest extent possible, you should mute your phones so that we don't get unnecessary background noise. I would now like to advise all council members and the city clerk that any votes taken during this teleconference meeting must be taken by roll call. I would ask that Madam Clerk take that roll call for any and all votes. I would begin with our agenda, item E, the Pledge of Allegiance. And if I could have Councilmember Barajas lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance, please.
Yes. Salute, pledge. I pledge allegiance to the flag
To the
of the
flag
United States
of the
of
United
America
States of America,
and to the
to
republic
the
for which it
republic
stands,
which stands
one
one nation under God,
God, indivisible,
indivisible,
with liberty
and
and
liberty
justice
and
for all.
justice for all.
Thank you, Councilmember Barajas. We're now going to move to item F on tonight's agenda. That's public comment. And Madam Clerk, since the council chambers are closed to the public, is there a member of the public who has submitted an email or left you a voicemail for the general public comment portion of our meeting?
I do have one email that was and voicemail messages, so I can go ahead and read the email first.
Hold on, Madam Clerk. We have a lot of background noise.
Yes, I hear that. Can everyone please mute yourselves?
Go ahead, Madam Clerk.
Thank you. Good evening. For the last 3 weeks, I have asked the county to add recovery numbers to the dashboard, but still have not seen them. Since the number of cases is so low, this should be an easy number to determine so that we can make good health decisions. Also, the recovery numbers from assisted living facilities, since this is a major portion of cases and deaths. Can you get this expedited? Thanks for your help with this, Barbara Ryan.
Thank you, Madam Clerk. Do you have any others?
No, this is the only email I've received.
Thank you. That'll take us to item D, council and staff statements.
Mayor Lansford,
Yes.
camera for my team to play the voicemail messages.
My name is Joseph Aragon, and I was wondering why you never tell how many people in Yolo County don't have the COVID-19 anymore, and how come we always just keep going up and we show how many we got and never show how many we have gotten well. So we always just keep the same number of 6 people. Some of them got to get well sometime. Evidently, we always have one, it goes up one, never goes down. I'd like to see what the real numbers are. Thank you very much. I appreciate you listening to me. You have a wonderful evening. Bye-bye.
Are there any others, Madam Clerk?
City Council of Woodland. My name is Cameron Williams, and I am a former resident, proud resident of Woodland. Had my first job when I was 12 with the Daily Democrat, District 5. My father actually worked at Woodland Christian Junior High School, and we were very proud residents of Woodland. And I am the current Royal Arch High Priest at the Woodland Royal Arch Chapter number 46. We were just off of 228 Palm Avenue in Woodland. I'm also a Freemason there as well. And my reason for bringing this voicemail out to you folks is we actually have a big part in this July 4th celebration. And we have a fireworks booth that we sell fireworks at. A lot of that money, in fact, most of it goes to goes to scholarships. It goes to actually funding our youth programs. And we do save some, but a lot of that goes back into the community. And we also support our public schools through our initiatives, through our Grand Lodge, our Freemason Grand Lodge in San Francisco. So we are continuously pouring back in the money that we get or receive from these fireworks sales, as well as other events that we're able to put on for the community. That money is generated, goes right back into the community. So I just wanted to let my voice be heard respectfully. Again, I was one of the proud resident of Woodland. I live in Sioux City now, but I grew up in Woodland, a special place in my heart. And I realize that you folks are doing the best that you can at keeping our community safe. I agree with you, but I would also ask that maybe there is other options as far as keeping our community safe. Social distancing, proper masks, balaclavas, etc. And I would just ask that you guys would just listen to our voice. Thank you.
Any others, Madam Clerk?
Mayor, City Council, and staff. This comment is for the May 19th City Council meeting for agenda item 13. My name is Kimberly Cargyle, and I would like to take this opportunity with cannabis on the agenda to request the council to move forward with developing a regulatory framework and permitting process for storefront retail dispensaries. The cannabis industry has been deemed essential. It is providing much needed jobs and tax dollars during this extremely difficult time. We would like to bring our service-oriented business model to provide much needed clean and stress relief for those who want a natural approach to medicine. Thank you for all you do to make Woodland a great place to live and work. I look forward to working with you in the future as we develop a regulatory process.
I believe that's a good
Mendez, and I'd like to leave a comment for tonight's City Council meeting for item 13. My name is Laura Mendez. I've been coming to City Council meetings for 5 years now, requesting that you move forward with regulating retail sales of cannabis. Cannabis has been deemed as an essential business and much needed tax dollars from our industry to help the city move forward on many needed projects. We have thousands of members that drive all the way to Sacramento to come to our dispensary at Therapeutic Alternatives. We run a very respected and reputable business that would like to bring the same to the city of Woodland. I'm respectfully requesting that we move forward in writing an ordinance allowing retail stores. Thank you.
Okay, now it looks like.
Was that the same message or is it a different one?
I don't know.
Okay, so that's it?
Mr. Mayor,
Yes.
Allard here. I couldn't understand either of the last two callers. I mean, it's all garbled listening on my iPad. So perhaps afterwards, the clerk could try to just transcribe some of it so that we can get the benefit of what the callers were trying to share. Thank you.
Yes, I can do that.
Thank you. For the record, though, Ms. Dowd, I think it was regarding item 13 on the consent calendar.
Thank you.
All right, that takes us to item G, council and staff statements. Start with Councilmember Rodriguez. Is she on yet?
Yes, Mr. Mayor, I am on.
Okay.
It's council communication. Not much to report on my end. I have to say I've been running around quite a bit, and this pandemic is keeping me very, very busy. I just want to thank the community for supporting each other and hanging in there. And we've gotten through over a month and change of the pandemic, and you know, hopefully soon we'll get some more activity out there for folks to participate in. Keeping in mind the safety measures and guidelines that have been provided to us from the county and state level. That is all for me, Mr. Mayor. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Rodriguez. Councilmember Fernandez.
Thank you, Mayor Landsberg. I've got nothing significant to report.
Thank you, Councilmember Fernandez. Councilmember Barajas.
Yeah, I have nothing to report, Mayor Landsberg.
Thank you. Mayor Pro Tem Tom Stallard.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. City manager and the community services officer and I attended Councilwoman Socia Rodriguez attended the 2x3x2. That's the gathering we have with officials from the educational community. And I just wanted to report that they're concerned about the broadband services in our community and beyond. And we're going to be pursuing that at a subsequent meeting. And following up on this, I've noticed we've made considerable progress over the years. So that's the good news. But that's the leading concern at this time at that group. I also want to mention that received a notice from four-wheel campers, a Woodland business that employs 91 people, that they resumed production this week, and that they called all 91 of their workers, and every one of them has returned to work. That's a wonderful story that we can all hope is repeated in the coming days. We also heard a report from the Woodland Chamber of Commerce from True Value Hardware Distribution that their business has increased 34% in the pandemic. So obviously, some businesses are obviously profiting and prospering in this situation, and we can be glad about that as well. And their big problem is hiring qualified workers to expand their workforce. So it isn't all bad news. But before I conclude, I'd just like to say that the Business Journal reported today as breaking news that the Sacramento restaurants are authorized to reopen on Thursday. The Board of Supervisors took no similar action at their board meeting this morning. And I'm personally reaching a point of aggravation on this point. I feel like we should be allowing businesses to return to work. People who want to continue social distancing and remain in isolation will always have that right. They can have their groceries delivered and pretty much any other services provided. But I think people who have to make their living through their work and their small businesses and their restaurants, really the time has come to loosen things up to where they can go back to work with appropriate regulations perhaps, but at least let them make their living. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem Stallard. My comments are brief. This week, the city announced the cancellation of our annual 4th of July city-sponsored events. I understand there are a lot of disappointed people, but we need to be mindful of everyone's safety. The decision was not easy to make, but your safety was the forefront of our thinking. However, I have fielded questions about whether or not this had an effect on the sale of safe and sane fireworks. It does not. There should be regular sales of safe and sane fireworks throughout the city of Woodland. I would encourage residents to buy from these vendors because most of these groups that are selling fireworks in these booths are actually fundraising for various community groups or local organizations. So let's keep that in mind, that part of the 4th of July has not been canceled. On behalf of the city, let's look forward to 4th of July 2021. We're going to come back with bigger and better programs. Today, we were informed that the 129th Rescue Wing of the California Air National Guard at Mountain View will be conducting a flyover at various Central Valley cities, including Woodland. This will be taking place on Memorial Day. The flyover is part of the Department of Defense Operation America Strong campaign that features both Thunderbirds and Blue Angels flying over cities across America. The purpose of the flyover is to thank healthcare workers, first responders, and other essential personnel on the front lines. Stand in solidarity with those who personally have suffered and experienced loss during this pandemic. The flyover will include aircraft from the 129th Rescue Wing, conducted with FAA standards. The route will include going over our hospital. More details will be coming soon as they provide an actual time frame for our community. We look forward to that. I do also want to echo Mayor Pro Tem Stallard's concerns about opening our businesses. We are working closely with the county on getting some things done. I do expect some good news any day, anytime, which will have some effect on some of these businesses that have been shuttered for quite some time. Bear with us as we get through this process, but it is coming. That concludes my comments. Mr. Hyatt.
Thank you, Mayor. I will reserve most of my comments for the COVID-19 update as well as budget. I do want to have two specific comments relative to tonight's agenda. First, I do want to acknowledge there was no reportable action out of closed session. And then also, you should have received today an updated H10 item, staff report as well as resolution. There was a technical correction that we caught after we posted the agenda. So I want to make sure that you acknowledge that amendment. That will be part of that action as part of your consent calendar. That concludes my updates. Turn to long range calendar real quick. And we're coming near to the end of the fiscal year. So we've got tonight's meeting and then two more before we close out this current fiscal year. So much of the agendas moving forward will be centered around budget discussions. But specifically on June 2nd, we will introduce the proposed budget for 2021, followed on the 16th by the final ordinance to adopt the budget. We will also have a presentation on the 2nd from Jesse Salinas, who has requested an opportunity to come to speak to the council regarding election planning for this November. There's new guidance relative to how to conduct elections in the context of COVID-19. So he'll address the council and the community regarding some of those planned changes to upcoming elections. On the 2nd as well, we will be introducing draft ballot language for the Measure J renewal, including the 4 advisory measures that went along with the Measure J, consistent with council recent direction on that. And then also want to remind council the June 2nd meeting, we hope to be able to present to the council successful bids for construction of the homeless shelter at Beamer and 102. Those bids are due the end of next week. So we hope to get good bids and be able to present to council the opportunity to move forward with construction of that homeless shelter this summer. Along with several agreements, one with the county and one with Fourth and Hope for the operation and funding of the shelter. With that, one other note, on June 16th, we will be presenting to the council our board and commission appointments. We do have several vacancies pending, and we're actively recruiting for board and commission appointments, and encourage council, if you're aware of any community member that would be interested in serving on a commission. We do have some vacancies still available, and we'll be accepting applications for a couple more weeks and then working with a subcommittee to review those and make a final recommendation to the council on the 16th. So that concludes my review of long range. I'll give it back to you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Mr. Hyatt. That takes us to item H, the consent calendar, items 3 to 13. Is there a member of the council who wishes to pull an item from the consent calendar, items 3 through 13? Hearing none, I do want to address number 8, Mr. City Manager, if I can.
Yes, I'll provide a quick context. So that is what's referred to as the West Woodland Safe Routes to School project, also known as the West Court Street rehabilitation. So you recall that that project was initiated over a year and a half ago. Mid-project, we discovered some shallow utilities and ultimately worked out with a contractor to have them demobilize so that we could work with the utility companies to get those utilities relocated. And given the circumstances at the time, the contractor had no predictable schedule, and so that contract was terminated. And what we're bringing back as part of consent tonight is a contract to complete the balance of that project. I've asked Katie Warzel to give you a little bit more background on both the funding for the project, because as you will note in the action, there is a significant request for additional funding to complete the project. Also want to give the council and the community assurance that this project, once initiated, will have a pretty clear path to completion now that most of the uncertain conditions within the project area have been addressed. So Katie, I believe you're on the call as well. Would you mind providing a little more background and detail and assurance to the council?
Yes, good evening, council. This is Katie Warzel, Capital Projects. As Ken explained, the reasons for delay, all of those combine to create a need for an increase in the budget. I do want to start by saying that the bids we received were actually fair bids, and they are not the sole reason for the budget increase. We have some needs to increase the budget that are compounding, and for to start, we have items from the old contract, the original contract, that were costs associated with delays due to that utility conflict that Ken mentioned. We had the cost to winterize the project while we were waiting to finalize the situation with PG&E and determine the final shutdown. Then once it was determined that we were going to shut down the project, we had to go back and put in some more permanently temporary, if you will, paving and signal wiring that would include things like the traffic signal, bringing the traffic signals back up into operation, street lighting, things like that. Further, there were the staff, material, and labor costs just associated with terminating the contract, things such as the time and labor it took to walk through the process of termination with the contractor, and their costs associated with that as well, and the final change order that came with that. With the new contract, we do have items that we paid for originally that we do have to pay for again. These are things such as mobilization, traffic control, and SWIPy. Mobilization is generally where the contractors pay for their bonds and get reimbursed for the cost to bring equipment and material to the site. Traffic control obviously keeps people out of the work areas. And those are costs that we had to pay with the original contract that we do have to pay again. Then there are a few items such as raising of manholes. When we bring the manhole lids to the final grade of the roadway, we had to do that originally, and now we have to do it again with this portion of the contract, and the traffic signal work and things like that. Plus the cost to manage the project, inspect it, do all of our Caltrans required materials testing. I do want to echo what Ken said, that we do feel very strongly that this project will be completed expeditiously, because the only major component to do at this point is the roadway and then reestablishing the traffic signals.
Thank you, Katie. I did have a question on the source of the extra funding to get this project done.
So the bulk of the additional funding is road funding that we have been able to cobble together in part from multiple sources. One was some leftover fund balance from a project that was completed under budget that was directly transferred over. Another was, or actually two of the other pieces were from measures E and F in project balances and fund balances that were anticipated, or were not anticipated, but were leftover funding that were able to be used for this. And then the rest of it is, we had set aside about $500,000 in the spending in our Measure F spending plan that was allocated to this project that made up the bulk of the difference.
Great, thank you. And my last question on this item is going back to West Court Street going to have interference with completing the project on West Main Street? I don't think folks are interested in having two major arteries clogged up at the same time.
Neither is staff. No, we don't anticipate. We anticipate the final paving on Main Street to occur in the middle of June, early to mid-June. Then we have to wait a period for the asphalt to cure out, and then we can restripe the road and open it back up. And then we'll be restarting Court Street. There might be some minor work to be done. We have a little bit of storm drain and water work to be done during the early parts of the Court Street project that might require some minor traffic control, but nothing akin to what you saw when we started the project or what you've seen on Main Street.
Right. Well, thank you for that update. It clears up a lot of the questions I had on that item. Thank you, Ken, and thank you, Katie. Is there a motion then regarding consent items 3 through 13?
Move to approve.
Fernandez moved.
I'll second.
Sounds like the motion was made by Councilmember Fernandez, seconded by Councilmember Barajas. Madam Clerk, a roll call vote, please.
Yes, Councilmember Barajas,
Yes.
Councilmember Fernandez,
Yes.
Mayor Landsberg,
Yes.
Councilmember Rodriguez,
Yes.
Mayor Pro Tem Stallard.
Yes.
Thank you. The consent calendar carries on a 5-0 roll call vote.
Thank you, Madam Clerk. That takes us to item I, City Manager Reports. Mr. Hyatt.
Yes, so good evening. The first report pertains to an ongoing COVID response and preparedness update. So a short update really for you this evening as you know, the pandemic continues to proceed at a fairly steady pace. If anybody again tracks the county's dashboard today, we are now at 185 total confirmed cases in Yolo County citywide. We have 91 of those. Of the total confirmed cases, 22 have now been reported as deaths. So again, you continue to see very little growth in these numbers, a testament, I believe, to the diligence throughout the community to abide by the guidance that's been provided by the state and refined by our Yolo County Health Officer. So I do want to continue to commend our community to follow that guidance and appreciate their efforts to date. Continue to see good news from our departments that we have 0 confirmed cases and actually nobody currently even being monitored for concern with being positive for COVID. So want to commend staff as well for being diligent in their efforts to protect themselves, but at the same time be responsive to community needs. I think we reported a couple weeks ago that Woodlands was home to one of the, I believe, 80 now statewide testing centers. So Yolo County, 2 weeks ago, we opened up a testing center, appointment only. As of to date, we have performed or confirmed that we have had 1,000 tests performed here at our facility. And given the slow growth in our confirmed cases here throughout Yolo County and specifically in Woodlands, with the increasing number of tests being performed, I think it's a testament to the confirmation that the fear of community spread of the disease is not present. All indicating right to the county and ultimately to the state that we should be in a position to begin to move forward further to phase 2. So a lot of our energy has really been focused on working with the county health officers, administration there to help advocate for the necessary criteria metrics to position the county to move forward into phase 2. Last week, the county did submit their attestation documents to the state, which is necessary to be affirmed by the state in order for our county to move forward into the next phase of stage 2, which would allow more business activities and community activities to proceed. Unfortunately, given some of the reported deaths in Yolo County, we had to go to extra effort to try to articulate to the state that those deaths that were being reported were not evidence of community spread, and therefore, given those circumstances, our situation here in Yolo County would be one where we would be allowed to move forward, like many other counties, into phase 2. Unfortunately, that was denied. However, on Monday, the governor, as you know, did announce modified criteria that removed the death criteria from the county's requirements. The county modified their attestation document earlier this week and have resubmitted it now to the state and now are awaiting state response and hopefully approval of that document. The Board of Supervisors this morning had extensive conversation and discussion about in anticipation of the state's approval, when will the county and the county health officers be comfortable then moving into deeper phases of phase 2 and allowing businesses as well as retail, non-essential retail doors to open up. And the feedback I received from the county administrator was that the Board of Supervisors maintains somewhat cautious in advancing into phase 2 and directed staff to come back at their meeting next Tuesday with a more comprehensive evaluation and assessment about how prepared our businesses are that are not currently allowed to fully operate or even operate partially to move forward. And so we will be actively working with the businesses that will be in that next wave to ensure that as soon as the county does grant permission for them to open up, and hopefully as early as next Tuesday or Wednesday, that we will not have an additional waiting period for them to be allowed to open up. So actively working with the county staff to inform the guidance for these businesses, which is complex. And so the education phase is going to be critical for us to ensure that our businesses know what the criteria are for them to be allowed to open and what kind of interaction they will have with the city and the county as we move forward. So unfortunately, we continue to be in a phase of uncertainty as we anticipate being allowed to go back to life as normal, but we have small victories here and there throughout the week that we have been successful in building a case and working with a county health officer to allow certain activities to proceed. But the real big next step will be allowing those restaurants as well as breweries and retail to open up, and anticipate hopefully next week to be able to announce that. And then lastly, we are, of course, looking to see if the federal government ultimately introduces bills that will succeed in passing in their budget process this year. There's multiple bills that ultimately could provide some financial relief to local jurisdictions of our size. That process, as we know, will be very fluid and highly political. However, at this point, we are not counting on any of that federal relief, given the magnitude of what's being discussed. But as we move forward through our budget process next year and learn more about where those bills are heading, we will be in a position to adapt and respond to any potential relief funding that will be available to us. So that concludes my remarks on the COVID, and welcome council to any questions you might have on the state of COVID here in Woodland.
Thank you, Mr. Hyatt. Is there a member of the council who has a comment or question for the city manager on this topic? Hearing none. Madam Clerk, have we received any comments or questions from the public on this particular item, number 14?
We have not.
Thank you. This is just a presentation, is that correct, Mr. Hyatt? With nothing to do?
That is correct.
Thank you. Thank you for the update, and just keep working with the county to get them to work on expediting this opening of these businesses. I know that they're anxious to do it as well, but just need a clearance from the governor to get it done. Let's keep our fingers crossed and keep moving forward to get where we need to get to on that. Thank you. That takes us to item number 15.
Good. Again, Mr. Mayor, thank you for the opportunity to present our budget recommendations for our balancing plan for 2021 to you and your council members. I'm going to provide a brief overview, and then I'm going to hand over to Kim McKinney to walk you through an updated set of forecasts from what you saw at your spring budget workshop back in April. We have received updated sales tax information specifically that has modified our forecast. After Kim walks you through the budget forecasts and gives you a sobering picture of the challenge ahead of us, I will then sort of walk through the 3 tiers of funding reduction measures that are outlined in the proposed budget balancing plan. And then we do have some minor funding requests that have been submitted by various departments to fulfill unmet needs or very specific needs that we are proposing to include in the proposed budget for next year. So we'll talk specifically about what those items are. And then we'll turn it back over to the council for comments and feedback. Again, tonight's presentation, we're not seeking any final decisions from the council. We welcome comments both in general, but specifically on any of the line items that we will be presenting. We will take this feedback tonight and bring back a proposed budget at your June 2nd meeting where you have the full package of the budget recommendations before you. Again, tonight is really focused on our general fund budget, which is our largest and most impacted discretionary budget in the city. So it's, as always, with every budget cycle, the focus of your budget discussions. We do also have other funds that are anticipated to be significantly impacted as a result of the economic situation we are in, specifically associated with gas tax revenues. So we will identify those as well this evening. So Kim, if you would like to now bring up the forecast spreadsheets and walk the council through the 2 scenarios that we outlined for them 2 weeks ago, to provide a framework for the balancing plan, that would be great. There you go.
Okay, so here on the screen, we have an updated version of the general fund 5-year forecast. As Ken mentioned, we have received some additional information since the last time you saw this forecast. Primarily, that change in information was updated sales tax revenue information from a consultant that we work with on a regular basis. So that information that we got actually was a little, or it was worse than what we had before. And so we downgraded our revenue assumptions, both for the remainder of this fiscal year and primarily in fiscal year 2021, our baseline budget year. The years following that were fairly close to what we had included in our forecast before. So the largest changes will be the first green column and the blue column for next year. And one other change that we made to the baseline assumptions in the expenditure line item was that our forecast previously included funds in the general fund to match the COPS grant that we had applied for that would have provided some level of funding for 3 new police officer positions. Given the situation that we're in and the funding forecast that we have, we've decided to not include that in the forecast. And when we get word about the final decisions regarding the COPS grant, whether or not we were awarded that grant, we could consider it at that time. But it's likely that we would, at this point, not accept that grant. So for the time being, we've made that change in our forecast assumptions that we would not be paying for the COPS grant throughout the 5-year forecast. So what these changes mean to the general fund, again, the focus on the second green column right here, the fire station funding was removed, the $1 million that we set aside. We updated revenue numbers for sales tax primarily, and again, expenditures remain same. So under this scenario, and we have a second scenario of the budget, as if you recall from last time, and we'll go over that in a few minutes, we would expect to end this year with a 27% general fund unreserved fund balance at almost $13.3 million. The next year, again, with these revised revenue assumptions and with the changed expenditure assumptions, we're forecasting now a $1.68 million deficit in the general fund. We've included on here some one-time funding requests that we'll go over again later in this presentation. And if we were to make no changes, no reductions, we would end next year with a fund balance of just under $11.2 million, which would be 23% of general fund revenues. still in excess of our 20% target, but we would quickly fall below that target starting in 21, 22. And again, fully exhaust all general fund reserves sometime between fiscal years 23 and 24. Again, if we made no structural changes for expenditure baseline assumptions. So this was the scenario A, we called it before, which was sort of a more moderate view of the revenue impacts related to the COVID situation. Scenario B, which was is worse case than the last one, and really has more impacts to our revenues overall. It's a deeper reduction in sales tax revenues, and many of our other revenue sources in this scenario would be impacted similar to how they performed during the recessions back 2008 through 2010. We did not change our revenue assumptions in this forecast. They were not significantly affected by the revised revenue information that we got from our sales tax consultant. Consistent with the last forecast that you saw, we did take the COPS grant out of this one as well. So this continues to show $1.1 million as a forecasted deficit for this fiscal year, growing to potentially $3.135 million next year, where again, we would fall below the 20% reserve target if we did nothing, and the growing reserve to almost $9.8 million in the last year, and totally using up general fund reserves somewhere between fiscal year 22 and fiscal year 23. So that's just a quick look at what has changed since the last time we went over this with you. And we'll revisit this again when we talk or what are potential tiered reduction scenarios and how they affect these forecasts moving forward. So this is just a reminder also, during the April budget meeting, we mentioned that there's several different ways that we're looking at balancing the budget. Some of those include looking at vacant positions, considering freezing hiring, looking at delaying or reducing contributions throughout the general fund, or anything that we might have some level of control over. And we also asked the departments to provide reductions. The targets were 5% of their general fund baseline budgets for all departments, with the exception of public safety. They were asked for 2.5% of their general fund budget as a target, and that was a $1.5 million goal for all the departments. What they did provide, and what we'll go over shortly, is just over that target of $1.5 million. So everyone worked really hard to come up with ways to save money in the general fund and try to minimize impact on operations as much as possible. But there's not a lot of easy stuff left at this point. So that was just a reminder of what the target was, and Ken's going to go over with you what we've included in our different tiers of reductions in the budget.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Kim. So the numbers that Kim just showed relative to the requested budget reductions across the departments, we worked with department heads to take those proposed measures and outline them in essentially what you see here, a three-tier reduction plan, with tier one being our recommendation to incorporate into the proposed budget for next year, with tier twos and tier three actions, basically creating a framework and a plan should our revenues as we progress throughout the year favor more towards the revised recession scenario that Kim walked you through, where our revenues fall way short of historical, or at least the last few years, and worsen beyond our favorable projections. And so the first tier reductions that you see here, again, are attempts to categorize these, yet still achieve the savings necessary to deliver a balanced budget, focused on minimizing impacts on occupied positions within the budget, and take a cut towards finding positions that were currently vacant that could be eliminated while minimizing service level impacts. So quickly walk you through The list here that it would be ultimately recommended as part of the baseline budget. The city attorney contract reduction, the first one on the top there, proposing to curtail that budget by about $25,000 to align with actual cost based on our recent history. And so we will manage towards a reduced city attorney contract budget and stay within that historical average over the last few years. IT savings, this $25,000 represents reduction of IT services, primarily in the form of eliminating costs for the annual city mobile app, which is about $15,000 a year. Given the limited use of that app, talking with IT staff, we believe there's a more cost-effective way to provide a similar service. So we'll eliminate membership of that app, as well as decrease some of the maintenance schedules on some of the equipment and get more useful life out of them. The next line item here is elimination of an accounting tech position. This is a position that the council just authorized this year. Recruitment had started, however, the position has not been filled. So in working with the finance officer, recommending that position be included in this first tier and simply absorb the tasks that that position was anticipated to fill within the existing staffing. The next line item is reducing finance contract services in the amount of $35,000. This is largely associated with the contract services that we anticipated would be necessary to perform audits on our cannabis businesses. To date, we have yet to complete a full audit of the cannabis businesses, but we have been using limited use of our consultant services, and we believe that we have the staff capacity and expertise to perform those audits without robust reliance on consultants to do that for us. Next line item is reduction in water use in the parks. So in talking with our parks maintenance folks, we believe that given advances over the last few years in management of our irrigation systems, we will be able to achieve savings beyond what our current baseline currently anticipates of about $65,000. The next item, our senior planner, we're proposing to shift some of his funding towards $10,000 equivalent towards a supportive housing grant that we have received. Second item below that is elimination of the crime analyst. This would be a second full-time position in the crime analyst division. Council may recall this was a recent addition that was approved, I believe, as part of the mid-year budget. The position has not been recruited for yet, so we're recommending to include that position as a elimination and baseline savings. And then graffiti program funding transfer. Currently, we contract for graffiti abatement. That contract is just shy of $50,000. The police chief recommended consideration of moving that contract into Measure J for at least for 2 years until we know where Measure J is going. And potentially, if Measure J does not renew, be faced with having to eliminate that graffiti abatement program or find alternative means to address graffiti in the community. The next line item is transfer police officer to Measure F funding, $213,000 roughly to support this officer's coding to be transferred to Measure F. Would not have any impact on operations, just simply reduce our flexibility in the Measure F spending plan, but we felt, again, it was appropriate to include due to the critical nature of providing public safety in our community and the advisory measure for Measure F to provide that funding there. The SB2 funding for our social services manager. So SB2 is a new funding source available to cities, and within that grant criteria, there is certainly the ability for cities to use that funding to pay for social services and positions, and we're recommending to shift some of the funding for that position out of the general fund to that SB2 grant funding. Next line item is for fire overtime reduction. The first tier reduction in fire, and we'll talk through the next two, would essentially come in the form of reduced reliance on overtime as a result of the recent positions and the hires that we brought on through the SAFER grant. So with the additional firefighters that have now been added to the departments, there'll be less need and demand on fire overtime, and anticipate that to equate to about a $25,000 savings beyond our baseline assumptions. The remaining items here, for the most part, are basically a reduction in supplies, services, and management of resources that we have to maintain facilities and operations, which we believe would not have significant impact on our ability to maintain our facilities and services for at least a short period of time. The larger items below that include elimination of the sports park turf replacement, $50,000, as well as the facility replacement funding. So currently the baseline budget assumes supplemental funding for future replacement. We believe we have the funding allocated through measure E and F to replace the sports park turf next year, and the need for additional supplemental funding for future replacement would not be needed. Similarly, for the facilities, the council has included in recent budgets supplemental funding towards deferred maintenance, essentially, on city facilities. That fund currently is fairly healthy, and we have a backlog of projects to complete, so the additional $75,000 next year would not be necessary. And then the council may recall the city managers and the county administrator sent out a letter about a month and a half ago requesting our JPA partners to, as part of their budget process, consider a 5% reduction target that would ultimately translate to a reduction in our support contribution to those JPAs. So far, we have heard from YICA that they were able to present a budget that would translate to $110,000 in general fund savings to the city of Woodland. Similarly, we just got communication last week from the county that the animal services budget that's being proposed would include effectively a $38,000 reduction over what we had assumed in our baseline budget for animal services next year. And then LAFCO, smaller budget and a smaller number, provide a 5% reduction, which translates to $7,000 in savings to our city general fund. So you can see in total here, these would achieve about $1 million in reductions over the baseline, which goes a long way towards addressing some one-time and some structural challenges in our budget. Also want to point out that within the Tier 1 proposed package, we would also request consideration to downgrade a maintenance supervisor position by about $25,000 and have that position be changed to a lower level position in the division, largely as a result of the need to find savings for positions that are funded by our gas tax, as we anticipate significant reduction due to the lower price and lower utilization of gasoline. So that's the summary of Tier 1 reductions. And maybe before I jump into Tiers 2 and 3, if the council has any questions about these line items, since again, these would be our recommendation to be incorporated into the proposed budget, as opposed to Tiers 2 and 3, which will be identified as a plan to achieve further savings should those be necessary throughout the budget year next year.
Thank you, Mr. City Manager. Any member of the council have a question or comment for the city manager regarding Tier 1 reductions he just read out?
Yes, Mr. Mayor, I have a question. Mr. City Manager, in cutting out the $75,000 for the facility replacement and then the $50,000 for the sports park replacement, in cutting those out, that means we wouldn't be getting these projects done. Is that correct?
No, in fact, the sports park turf replacements, we believe we have sufficient funding in place to replace all three all-weather fields at the community center next year. And so this funding has been part of the baseline budget. And given the fact that we've already found the funding we believe sufficient, we won't need to incorporate it into the baseline, at least moving forward for the next few years. Similarly, for the facilities replacement, we do have, due to some accumulation of prior allocations, sufficient funding to complete our current workload of projects. And so, again, at least for the short term, we do not believe incorporating $75,000 for facility replacement and maintenance next year would be needed to achieve the project. So these would be short term and really need to be reevaluated as part of next year's budget or the budget the year after that to see if we are going to be falling short for keeping pace with future needs for facilities.
Okay, and I won't jump the gun too much, but in any case, I know we set aside 500,000 for the sports park in itself for long-term projects. That I think that if we fall short in any place here for overdue projects for the sports park, that we can cover down from those 500,000. And that's all for me.
Thank you. Did a member have a question or comment? Hearing none, City Manager.
Okay, so moving into the tier 2 reductions. So we anticipate by the time we get to September, we'll have a better picture of where our sales tax revenues will be. We'll also have a better sense of what, if any, impact on our property tax revenues the current economic downturn is projected to have. And then I think the other important metric and revenue metric for us will be development activity. Since we do have a significant amount of revenue that comes in the form of fees for processing development. So we'll continue to track those over the course of the summer, and by September, we'll come back to the council and revisit the tier 2 and tier 3 reduction lists and see if any of these items are necessary to advance in order to achieve a balanced budget by the end of the year. And so I do want to point out, we're clearly in a very volatile and dynamic fiscal environment. So the tier 2 and tier 3 reductions are really necessary for us to be prepared should our revenues decline further than we had hoped. So we don't want to get to a point come September that we don't have a strategy and a plan in place. And so with that, what you see here is a list of about a half a dozen items that would achieve just shy of $600,000 of additional savings out of the baseline budget. We begin to see more impacts, though, on funded positions within the city. The first one here is elimination of a community services officer position. So this position responds to calls within the community that helps reduce uncommitted time for patrol officers. So this would translate to increased, calls for service to police officers and patrol officers to respond to, but would yield about $92,000 in savings. The next position is environmental resource program oversight. So as part of the proposed budget we intend to present is reassignment of the environmental environmental services program from Public Works into the Community Development Department. That program has been in Public Works for quite some time and has about 5 positions in it. And by relocating it to Community Development Department, there would be the ability to essentially reallocate some of the funding for the oversight of that program to current positions in CDD that are funded by the general fund. Along with that would be elimination of the deputy director position in the community development department. This is a position that was added about 3 years ago and would be an impact to a currently occupied position. About $110,000 would be the equivalent of the savings from that, from a partial year savings from elimination of that position. That would have the impacts in the form of potentially reduced ability to engage and advance the supportive housing project as well as the interim shelter, which that position is currently managing. We hope and believe that this position would not need to be eliminated, but should it have to be addressed come mid-year, that those two projects would hopefully be further along and maybe nearing path towards completion. So the impact on those projects could be minimal, but again, that position does provide valuable resource to our community planning efforts. The fire overtime reduction here is an additional $75,000 in overtime that would be available to the fire department. This would be a reduction in the flexibility of the staffing and translate to fewer staff on the ladder truck, specifically going from 4 to 3, resulting in reduced efficiencies and potential delays in some of the major calls that they respond to. I do want to certainly call out that implementation of this change would require a meet and confer process with the fire employee associations due to the minimum staffing level requirements. And then the next line item here, library temp staffing. So the library was not spared from our request for budget reductions, and they proposed to move some of their temp staffing hours into Measure J to provide continued operation and provision of those programs that are provided by their temp staff and well received by our community. We felt it was appropriate, again, to move this funding to Measure J and out of the general fund, given the express interest by the community to use Measure J to support library programming and services. The next line item is another elimination of a currently occupied position, environmental resource manager. General fund savings for this position would be just over $12,000. It would also have savings in other funds, but the position would result in elimination of the management oversight of that environmental services unit, dictating the need for us to reassign management of the environmental services program in CDD. And then the OPEB line item here, $100,000, would reduce the city's supplemental contribution to OPEB, at least for one fiscal year. You probably recall that the city has been contributing additional funding to OPEB to reduce our unfunded liabilities, translating to about $600,000 in our current baseline budget. And what this recommends is reducing that from $600,000 to $500,000, resulting in $100,000 of savings to the general fund. And then the indirect cost recovery has been an ongoing effort for us to essentially realign the allocation of our overhead across all funds to appropriately and more accurately correspond to the work being done in those units. So it's a constant moving target, and it's not to suggest that we won't continue to make progress in future years, but for next year, we will delay the implementation of this, resulting in about $140,000 in savings to the general fund. Okay, maybe we'll walk through Tier 3 real quick and then turn it back to the City Council. So the Tier 3 reductions, again, would result in about $700,000 of additional baseline savings, coming mostly in the form of these 6 items here: reclassification of rec staff from Measure J. So currently, the rec management staff has a position that's funded out of the general fund, and this would shift that funding again to Measure J, consistent with what we believe, again, the intent of Measure J was, but having an impact on our flexibility for use of Measure J and Measure J fund balance. So we see it as a limited term shift of funding until we understand better what the availability of Measure J funding will be. The next line item, elimination of facility maintenance worker 2. So this is a maintenance worker that's assigned to the community center. It's a full-time position currently occupied and would result in impacts to the service delivery out in the community center, requiring other staff that are out there to kind of flex hours to ensure we have coverage in the evening when we have events, and would obviously have an impact on our ability to keep up with the facility maintenance needs at the community center. But given, the thinness of our, positions that we have and how limited recovery we have seen since 2008, there's really very little by the time we get to tier 3 ability for us to make cuts without having impacts on occupied positions. The next item is library contract services supplies. So this would reduce the contract services budget for the library by about $41,000, translating to impacts in the form of patron access online, learning databases, tutoring, job search help, and other digital offerings. Training would also be reduced for the staff. So clearly an impact for users of the library, and also especially given, periods like this where people are not able to access the library in person and more reliance on online distance learning is becoming essential. There'll be real impacts there. And then the next two positions are police officer positions. So these two positions would not result in the lessening of current service levels because we have vacant positions currently available. But what these positions really translate to at the end of the day was the progress that we were making towards improving our ability to respond to police needs in the community, particularly homeless issues. And so the net elimination of these two positions would basically, set us back a little bit towards the progress that we were making, providing a better response to the community and the increasing crime and homeless issues that we see in the community. But those two positions translate to another $300,000 in savings, and would not result in elimination of any currently occupied positions, however. And then the last item here, the 175 roughly thousand in additional fire overtime reduction just makes that impact in the tier 2 that I described that much more difficult to achieve. In addition to reduced staffing on ladder truck and the engine, there would be likely brownouts that would result during high call service periods, resulting in calls that might not be responded to, that are lower priority calls, but ultimately, much impacted service delivery to the community. Again, this item would require a meet and confer with the Fire Employee Association, given the impacts to the staffing levels. So that concludes the tier reduction package proposal that we have before you. So clearly, there's no easy choices in any of this. I can walk you through the additional proposals that we will be incorporating into the budget relative to concessions with the bargaining groups that we will be initiating here shortly. So currently, we have over 8 employee groups that have individual contracts, and those contracts all have, additional compensation considered next year. And so we have initiated conversations with each of those groups around the budget challenges that we have before us, and we will be furthering conversations with them and ultimately hope to bring back to council concessions equitable across all groups that could yield close to $600,000 in general fund savings on the budget. And so what Kim has brought up here for you is a table that shows, across the 3 categories of access and use of our reserve fund balance, for this year to fill the gap of what we anticipate to be $840,000 shortfall. We're proposing to use reserves to fill that hole. Moving into next year, less reliance on the reserves due to the impact this year to the reserve fund, but looking to the tier one reduction list with the departments to achieve about $1 million in savings, and then employee MOU concessions resulting in about 600,000. So those three line items together would achieve the $1.6 million projected shortfall that we would believe, again, would be potentially a best case scenario. And I don't want to lose the opportunity to point out that this does not address our long-term budgetary structural challenge that you see here that grows over the following 4 years. And so there is still a lot of work to be done. So even though these impacts that I just walked you through would be real and difficult to achieve, we are not done in terms of trying to solve the growing problem in the general fund budget, which is, really a factor of our revenues not keeping pace with the cost. And so do want to leave you with, while we are recommending a proposed balanced budget for next year with measures that we will closely watch throughout the year to maintain that 1 year budget balance. But at the same time, we are going to have to be working diligently to monitor and address our long-term budgetary challenges. That will be no insignificant task. So that I will turn it back over to the mayor and the council for discussion and feedback on these recommendations. And again, we will take your comments and input this evening and use that to come back to you on June 2nd with a final proposed budget, and look forward to the council input. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. City Manager. Thank you, Kim. I do have a question for Kim, and it's this. The consultant, what kind of a range and time did he or she give you regarding these predictions? Was this short term through the end of the year, the next 2 or 3 years? Give us an explanation of the consultant's thinking is, say, short term, medium term, and then say 5 years.
Yeah, so the information we got from them was the most impact to our revenues would occur through the first 2 quarters of the current calendar year. So through June 30th would be the most heavily impacted timeframes for our sales tax revenues, with some moderate growth following after that. So it's not under the scenarios that we've talked about with them, it's not a protracted long-term recession scenario for the sales tax revenues. It's really a very fast and steep decline, and then kind of a leveling out and slow growth back. So really, it's closer to a 1.5 to 2 years of the larger reductions in our revenues.
All right. Thank you for that. Any member of the council have a question or comment for either Ms. McKinney or Mr. Hyatt? Apparently none. Let me just say this, Mr. City Managers, thank you for the work that you and the finance has done on this very difficult project of trying to predict what's going to happen short term, medium term, and long term. Certainly, I think we can get through 2021 with some damage, but not the greatest. Tier 1 reductions, I'm good with what you put on paper here. When you start getting to Tier 2, I do have concerns, and I'll lay it out right now. I'm very concerned about eliminating the deputy director position because we are not done with that project yet. That project, even though we may be breaking ground here soon, I'd hate to give up the level of expertise that this particular position brings to getting this thing off the ground, built out, and actually operating. So I'm hoping that we can avoid that at all costs. But perhaps if we do get to a point where we have to start eliminating positions, that we look elsewhere, because we need to get that project going and accomplished. We have way too much invested in that project to give up at this point and lose that talent, get this project built out. No one wants to see anybody reduced or cut completely from their positions. And the decisions will be difficult going forward. I understand that. To get to tier 3, we're talking some dangerous moves here by eliminating police positions. I am not in favor of eliminating any police positions, particularly sworn positions. And I just, we need to do what we can to avoid such a scenario. That's not good for us. It's not safe for us. That's my 2 cents on where we're at.
Mayor Landsberg, Councilmember Fernandez here. I had some comments. I just didn't get to my computer in time. I endorse everything the chief said thus far. There's no doubt we're in a uniquely unnerving time, and there's a lot of uncertainty kind of building up in the future. So I appreciate the presentation and staff's proactive measures, given the pretty bleak forecasting financially. But just to echo what a number of council members have I think, echoed in previously closed session, if I can, to reiterate what the mayor has stated, we should place our human capital above all else. So at all costs, I'm obviously ardently supportive of keeping on our staff members. We're all a team here within the city. There are people in our community who are struggling, who are making sacrifices. That being said, we need to make sacrifices within our city staff, but I don't think we should disinvest in the human capital that we as a community have invested in. So that's kind of where I stand there. It should be a last result to terminate somebody who we've added to our team. That's it for me.
Thank you, Councilman Fernandez. Anybody else have a comment or question?
Mr. Mayor, Councilmember Rodriguez.
Please.
I first want to thank staff for this presentation. Quite frankly, once we move past tier 1, I'm very unhappy with tier 2 and tier 3. I want to focus on making sure that we retain those employees that we currently have in place, and that we shift our attention towards a salary cut instead of letting folks go. So that's where I stand. And to speak to our community development director, deputy director position there, I consider our employee a very valuable asset to the city, and I want to make sure that we keep them in place. And that's all for me, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you for your comments. Anybody else?
Yeah, this is Councilmember Barajas.
You'll be a supervisor soon, sir.
Thank you, Mayor. Yeah, we're headed for uncertain times right now, and we've been here before, about 10 years ago, but I believe that we do have somewhat of a good idea, blueprint on how to be able to allow for some cuts to happen and have the possibility of being, going on the right path and making sure that our cities continue to be efficient. In terms of, having cuts to employee wages or layoffs, I think that should continue to be a discussion, obviously, between the council and the bargaining units, and just to ensure that that continues. And I know that we have a good relationship with all the bargaining units, and pretty sure they're going to tell us what they're looking for and what they need, and we'll eventually arrive to an agreement. So very confident with that process in place. In regards to the deputy position, I do believe that that's a valuable position, and that we can find a way to keep that position. But if it means that contract is negotiated between staff and the deputy, then that should take place, because we want to make sure that our projects that we have in line, especially the relocation of the homeless shelter, goes as seamless as possible. And the deputy in that position has taken a lot of good leadership on that project, and we just want to make sure that that project and others that he has been working on continue. So, thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Barajas. Anybody else?
Mr. Mayor, this is Mayor Pro Tem Stallard. I'm essentially in sync with everything I'm hearing from my colleagues. I was around the last time we had to live with the consequences of the Great Recession, and I just would respectfully remind everybody that we need to keep letting the financial facts guide us. And as hard and as painful as some decisions are, sometimes the things you do sooner are what save you later. In other words, savings in the early stage are compounding. But if you wait too long, the amount you have to save grows as your resources decline, and you have not been reducing your costs. So I think the staff has taken a very mature approach to this. I commend them. I don't want to see us lose anybody, but at the same time, we can't spend money we don't have. So let's maintain keep a sober look at this, and support our leadership of our city as they try to grapple with this challenging issue. So, fine, first tier is fine, second tier, third tier, those will require quite a bit more discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. City Manager, I have a question for you, or perhaps Kim, and it's this. It appears that we didn't consider any funding based on what Congress passed, I think today, regarding monies for local governments. Have we given any thought to looking at what we could expect should the Senate and the President sign the bill from such a source? I think it was $3 trillion, with I think it's a 500 billion towards local governments. Have we given any thought or consideration, any scenarios that would play out if we got our fair share?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, have not spent a whole lot of time trying to assess what those bills would translate to in terms of dollars to us at this point, until they become closer to reality. But, should significant, one-time funding come down from the federal government in the form of relief, first we'll evaluate what strings are attached to that, and, figure out how that begins to rebuild some of the, budget reductions that we've outlined here. I think, obviously, given the long-term, challenge that we're faced with, we will, be, first mindful of how that funding can help us build a better course to a more balanced future, right? So I don't want to, rely on one-time relief funding to solve our long-term, structural challenge. And so I think it would be an immediate process whereby we evaluate, the parameters around that funding. We come back to council with a recommended plan to restore some of the cuts that are in tier one, and certainly defers discussions around tier two and tier three reductions. But I think we come back with a thoughtful and mindful, sort of balanced approach to how to begin to allocate that funding, but do it in a measured way, of course. So we will, certainly track that very closely and stay in close contact with the council and bring back as soon as we have certainty around timing and amount for that funding. And so more to follow. Ms. McKinney, do you have any additional remarks on that?
I agree with what the city manager said about any funding that we get. We generally try not to spend money before we have it. But I agree that we certainly would consider anything that's available to us and reevaluate how that affects our budget moving forward.
Thank you. And then I have one last question, perhaps for Kim. Will we have any real numbers before we actually adopt a budget? When I'm talking real numbers, I'm talking about sales tax, et cetera.
I don't think we'll have another update from our sales tax consultant prior to adopting the budget. We just got an update, and we generally get an update from them every 3 to 4 months. So I don't expect any more updates prior to adoption of the budget, but it's something we'll be closely monitoring. And as soon as we have the information available, will help us to assess the forecast moving forward. But no.
Okay, great. Thank you. All right, any other questions or comments before we wrap this one up?
So, Mr. Mayor, I do want to sort of walk you through our last portion of this item, which is the recommended funding requests. So we do have some requests that were received from departments early on this year. And if you recall, that original list was over $10 million in unfunded needs and one-time budget requests. So we have pared that down, and so I've asked Kim to present to you sort of a summarized list of what each of those line items are, so that as we, again, prepare the final budget, you don't have any surprises when you see recommended funding request, particularly in the context of significant budget reductions that we just talked about.
All right.
Okay, thank you. I'm just going to quickly walk through, and yeah, as Ken mentioned, we received almost $10 million worth of funding requests from the departments during the budget process this year, which is, I think, reflective of how very much need still remains in all the departments. And we've had to be very careful and pare down what was asked for and what we'll be recommending or including in the proposed budget coming back to council. The largest line item right off the bat on the top there is replacement of the city's enterprise system. So this is the system we use for all of our financial accounting, for permitting, utility billing, human resources, basically everything that we do. The software we use is being phased out, so we need to plan to transition to something different. That's a very lengthy, very expensive process to go through. We've identified funding sources throughout the city that we're proposing to set aside into a singular fund source so that the money is available so we can begin or continue down the RFP process and eventually implementing a new system that probably will take at a minimum 2 years to get done. So that off the bat is about $1.5 million that we'll be setting aside, and that project will show up in the city's CIP. The second line item here is some temporary one-time funding for assistance in the community development department, processing building permits and other activity that's occurring right now. We're again calling this one-time money and will be dependent on revenues as they are generated. Related to that, the community development department also, because of low staffing levels and the high volume of work over the last couple of years related to development activity, uses external consultants to assist with building inspection and plan check. So this is some additional one-time money to supplement their baseline amount. We will continue to revisit this throughout the year, as we've done in previous years, to determine if additional funding is needed, and also based on the revenue that's being collected as part of development activity. Most years we've been setting aside $25,000 or up to $25,000 to provide funding for special events throughout the city that come up. We are proposing once again to include the money. If we are unable to participate or have events, we certainly wouldn't be spending the money, but we will have it there in the event that we can continue those activities as we have in the past. The next line item is some additional temporary staffing for Summertime Fun Club. This is not a general fund request, so these columns over here on the right will show other funds. These are anything that's not the general fund we've included over here. That there would be additional revenue collected related to this item, so it's cost neutral to the city overall. Again, this next line item, homeless services, we have allocated money each year for the last several years in the budget. We expect that there'll be a fair amount of money left over from the budget this year that we will carry over to have available next year. And then we're providing additional $25,000 of one-time money in the general fund. And again, we'll continue to reassess that throughout the year to determine if any additional funding might be required. The city offers generally an annual tree rebate program that we have money set aside outside the general fund that just needs to be appropriated. The next line item is it's a program that used to exist and is being reestablished through the county to provide mental health clinicians to participating agencies. So for $60,000 that we're including as one-time money here, this would pay for a resource that would be dedicated to the city of Woodland. That this resource, who our staff is already familiar with, would assist with responses to mental health related calls. And this person can be have a different level of access to those affected by the calls than our cops can. And it will also help free up some time for our officers to address other items outside the mental health activities. So all other agencies in the county are participating, and so we've included a one-time funding to see how that goes. And it was very, the police chief said was very valuable resource that we've used before. The police department periodically needs to replace their SWAT vests and also to have required training related to emergency vehicle operations. We are considering both of these one-time funding requests to be paid for out of our internal service fund that pays for insurance to cover those items. We have some one-time money included for a program to assist with towing abandoned RVs throughout the city. We've been getting a lot of feedback over that related that they're a safety hazard, they're an attractive nuisance. And so this is sort of a one-time funding pilot program to see what we can do for some of those abandoned RVs. The $59,000 included here was included in the Measure F spending plan that we included, or we brought to you at the last council meeting, and these are matching funds for the fire department to purchase self-contained breathing apparatus equipment that would primarily be paid for with an AFG grant if we are awarded the grant. The next four line items, all for the library, were also included in the Measure J spending plan that came to council 2 weeks ago. Some one-time money related to facility improvements and furnishings in the library, as well as some ongoing money for additional temp staff to allow for expanded hours at the Square One facility in the library. We briefly touched on the citywide facilities earlier when we talked about we are reducing the contribution or suggesting to reduce the contribution from the general fund this year because there is some built up fund balance there and there is a backlog of activity. So this is a appropriation that would address a number of projects throughout various city facilities, the largest of which being in City Hall for some roof repair, the largest one being the roof repair projects at City Hall. This is another large line item down here, is replacing a piece of equipment in our sewer division, and it's a closed circuit television truck. We are required through our permits with the state to view all of our sewer lines, and that helps us to identify which capital projects may need to be done to address aging or, in some cases, failing infrastructure. The piece of equipment that we have now is outdated and it spends a lot of time in the shop, and we are unable to find parts to to fix it and have it out, and therefore are getting a backlog of projects. So we do have sufficient one-time money in the sewer fund to purchase this piece of equipment, and we've included that here. There's some additional permit fees that are required for our water system that we're including as a funding line item. Another piece of equipment, and this is also in the sewer collection area, is a replacement of a tractor that's primarily used for weed abatement in all of the ponds and ditches. It's a substantial component of the work that they do in the collections area. And so this would be replacing the tractor with a skid steer mower, which is actually a more nimble and versatile piece of equipment. And then finally, in the water area, there's some software for our wells that need to be replaced. So all in all, it's just $3.1 million of funding that we're suggesting to be included in the proposed budget when it comes back to you. Included in that 3.1 is $432,000 of one-time money in the general fund, which which I've included on the forecast that we showed you earlier. There are no ongoing components in the general fund that we're including. And there's $2.5 million of one-time funding in all other city funds outside the general fund, with just under $117,000 of ongoing funding included in that as well. So that's the extent of the funding requests that will be coming back to you with for formal adoption in the budget.
Thank you, Kim. Anybody have a question or comment regarding the recommended funding request? Will be coming back soon. No questions, no comments. Thank you, Kim. Anything else, Mr. City Manager, on these on this number 15?
No, sir. That concludes the presentations for this evening on these items.
And there's nothing for us to move on regarding this item, right?
Correct.
Okay. But we will be moving on it. When do we expect to move on this?
So at your June 2nd meeting, we will introduce the proposed budget.
Okay. All right. I know that some of the council members have some questions on some of this. I think they'll meet with you one-on-one to discuss their questions and how we might fund some of these requests. So thank you for the presentation. And I believe that concludes that item. Is that correct, Mr. City Manager?
That is correct.
That brings us to the end of the calendar. Is there a motion to adjourn? Somebody made a motion to adjourn. Rodriguez, is there a second?
Second, Angel.
Second by Angel. Those in favor? Oh, strike that. Madam Clerk.
Councilmember Barajas,
Yes.
Councilmember Fernandez,
Yes.
Mayor Landsberg,
Yes.
Councilmember Rodriguez,
Yes.
and Mayor Pro Tem Stallard.
Yes. Goodbye,
Thank you.
everybody.
We're adjourned at 7:44 p.m. Good night, everyone.
Good night.